Good morning. Peace be upon you. Venerable Wuxing, distinguished speakers, dear respectable Dharma masters and venerables, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 3 of the Peace Education Forum. It is great to see you all. The topic for Plenary 6 is inclusive and integration, a religious and secular perspective. It is followed by a Q&A session chaired by Mr. Peter Rukas. We will take questions from the audience. Our first speaker for today is Reverend Dr. Jonathan Inkpin, the Rector of the Anglican Parish of St. Luke. Reverend Dr. Jonathan Inkpin is an Anglican priest, currently serving as Rector of St. Luke, Toowoomba. He has worked in a range of local and national capacities in both his native England and in Australia, including parishes, theological education, community development, social justice, peace and environmental advocacy, and inter-religious development. Among other inter-religious involvements, Reverend Dr. Jonathan Inkpin was a member of the Australian National Dialogue of Christians, Muslims and Jews from 2003 to 2007, organiser of the Sydney Pre-Parliament of Religions and Youth Pre-Parliament of Religions event in 2009, and a keynote speaker at New Zealand National Interfaith Conference in 2010. Reverend Dr. Jonathan Inkpin is also a member of the Goodwill Committee of Toowoomba. May I invite Reverend Dr. Jonathan Inkpin to the stage.
Good morning. It's great to be with you again. First of all, let me acknowledge the land on which we meet and its original custodians, the Gayabul and Jarawet peoples and their descendants, the elders past and present. May I also acknowledge with continued thanksgiving all who have worked so hard to make this conference a reality. In doing so, they have once again modelled for us inclusion and integration. So what are we to make of these impressive and challenging themes? Let me briefly outline a few religious ways into this question, opening up, I hope, one or two deeper issues. For from a religious perspective, whilst worthy enough, neither inclusion nor integration are in themselves sufficient for peace and harmony. Indeed, I would propose that they might even be mismanaged or misused on occasion by secular authorities who are only seeking mere toleration and order, for they fall short of the much greater religious vision and experience of shalom, of enlightenment or communion. For as human beings, we are together called to a very deep and deeper interrelationship than inclusion and integration alone. This is the relationship which Christians call the kingdom, or the companionship of God. It is also found, in different ways, in other religious traditions, where human peace and harmony are similarly understood to subsist ultimately in the very source, meaning and goal of all things, that which many traditions call God. Religiously speaking, inclusion and integration are therefore desirable byproducts of something else. This something else involves walking ways of compassion and transformation, for it is compassion and transformation, not merely inclusion and integration, which are at the heart of religious peace and harmony. So let me try to illustrate this by way of 4 images from my own walk with compassion and transformation. 4 images of ill-fitting shoes, of the brokenness or broken openness of disability, of the rediscovery of pilgrimage, and of the stone walls of my upbringing. Let's start with the ill-fitting shoes. Have you literally ever walked any distance in another person's shoes? It can feel quite strange and uncomfortable, but can also be quite revealing. It certainly brings you closer to another person than many other things. That is why many indigenous cultures have the same aphorism. Don't criticize someone, they say, until you have walked a mile in their shoes. Then you will connect. Then you will include them properly in your life. Some years ago, I was working as a rural and social responsibility officer for the church in my native County Durham in northern England. It is a wonderful area, which is sometimes known as the roof of England, or England's last wilderness. Much of it rises above where trees and other things can grow, and where only hardy sheep and grouse, and even hardier farmers, can eke out a living. One day I went to a sheep farm near the top of the fells, accompanied by the local Methodist minister. After a cup of tea, we donned gumboots to brave the cold and muddy terrain outside, and we made a tour of the farm, guided by our lively host. Afterwards, we were in a hurry to get back to other things, so we hurriedly threw off our boots and put on the shoes which were to hand. Only later that day, after we had both walked all over the village in which we lived, did my Methodist friend and I come to the same conclusion. We had been walking in each other's shoes. Both pairs of shoes were identical, or similar, very similar, but not identical. My shoes were just a little bit bigger and more spacious. So my friend's feet flapped around a little within them, and he had to grip a little harder with his toes. After a while, this meant that just occasionally he slipped a little, and his feet began to blister. I had the opposite experience. The shoes I was wearing felt just a little pinched on my feet. After a while, I stumbled occasionally, and my feet also began to blister. But for quite a time, we had managed to walk in each other's shoes. Now, some shoes are much more challenging to wear than the slightly different ones of an Anglican or a Methodist. Yet we undoubtedly gain a refreshingly different perspective when we walk, at least imaginatively, in another's shoes. We do not merely see one another from the outside. We begin to know one another from within. We not only include one another from our own point of view, we actually enter into each other's feelings and lives and begin to understand one another as God understands us. This is what our great religious traditions call compassion, which comes from those 2 Latin words, cum, meaning with, and passus, meaning suffering or experiencing, from which we also get the word passion. So, to walk in another's shoes is to cultivate compassion. It is to experience, to suffer, to share the passions with the other, not from the outside, but from the inside. It is more than mere inclusion, therefore, but it is also a vital gateway to inclusion. Significantly, this is also a message from those who are often excluded. Indigenous people, for instance, often challenge others to go beyond mere inclusion to genuine relationship. As our Anglican Torres Strait Islander Bishop, Saibo Mabo, has said to the rest of us, we need you to learn how to feel, to hear, to see, to taste and even smell with us, to walk with us, treat us as equals, and listen and learn from us. Our call, and he speaks as a Torres Strait Islander who are fond, as you know, of their cultural dances, our call is for you to come out and join our dance. Now, in like manner, a leading American campaign against sexual assault and gender-based violence is called Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. As part of this, it encourages men to walk a mile in women's high-heeled shoes as a means of cultivating a genuinely compassionate inclusivity. Similarly, disability groups invite others sometimes to spend a day in a wheelchair or with other limitations. And anti-poverty and asylum seeker groups may sometimes invite those who are richer and more comfortable to live for even a week on the meagre incomes and restrictions of the poor and the outcast. Now that can be a gimmick, but when it is not a gimmick, it can be powerful. And as an image, it encourages us to enter with compassion into the life of the others. What great examples of compassionate inclusion there can be too, and it can begin very simply with each and every one of us in simple ways like that, when others stand alongside others who are often excluded. As other than Muslim women have done, for instance, by publicly donning headscarves when Islamophobia is inflamed. Such compassionate action can indeed transform our world. Secondly, compassionate inclusion for me is well illustrated by the creative religious responses that are sometimes made to disability. One of the great living exponents of this is the French-Canadian priest Jean Vanier. For Jean was a successful university lecturer and philosopher. Slowly, however, he became increasingly drawn to people with intellectual disabilities, not so much to help them, but merely to share their lives. Repelled by how people with disabilities were shut away and excluded, especially years ago, he came to a radical act of compassion. Giving away his brilliant career, he went to live in a small house with two other men, both of whom had severe intellectual disabilities. And so he lived, he cooked and gardened, he laughed, he argued, he cried, he suffered, and he experienced everything with them. This was inclusion, but so much more. The two men taught and shared with Jean a deeper truth. For in this relationship of deep down compassion, Jean was himself able to begin to face his own brokenness, his own disabilities. So today, several decades later, and I've had the privilege of sharing in one or two experiences with the L'Arche community, this movement of compassion which Jean began now has 150 houses across the world, involving people of all backgrounds and faith outlooks. It is known as L'Arche, which is French for the Ark. And in relation to disability, it is a tremendous sign and pointer to the best kind of inclusivity, namely one that is grounded in divinely human compassion. For at the heart of all our lives is brokenness. That's the beginning point, in a way, of the journey of healthy religion and spirituality, to recognize our brokenness and not to scream with it and lash out at others or beat oneself up. None of us are perfect. All of us carry hurts and insecurities, uncertainties, selfish attitudes and drives. Yet all of us are loved and lovable. And so all of us can know compassion and share compassion with others once we grasp those realities. Now, the Christian tradition calls this kind of walking in compassion companionship. Again, the word has Latin derivations. From that word again, cum, meaning with, and from the word panis, which means bread. A companion, therefore, is someone who shares bread with another. Now, bread in the ancient world meant not just food, but all that we need for life. And so a true companion is someone who walks with another through all that life gives us and all that life takes away. So it's not surprising then that Jesus called his followers friends and companions. For these are they who share the life of Jesus. They are those who eat and drink as Jesus ate and drank, who share all that God gives. So no wonder Jesus also taught his followers, in the little bit of teaching he gave on prayer, to say the words, "Give us this day our daily bread." Or in other words, give us what we need for the day to find life and joy and compassion. What Jesus was inviting his followers to do was to be people who shared the bread of life with one another, to be companions to each other and to others. And as modelled by Jesus and by others who followed him like Jean Vanier, it is through that kind of companionship that all of creation is fully included in divine compassion. Now that all sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But it's very costly, as Jesus and Jean Vanier in his own way discovered. The call to compassion, to deep religious inclusion, comes from the heart of God. And that kind of inclusion is not at all easy to live. It's very different from the kind of inclusion which is essentially only toleration or good manners. Now they're good things, but they're not quite as deep as this journey. Those things, toleration and good manners, may be sufficient to hold our society together in relative outward peace and integration. But it's not, however, the religious vision of compassionate inclusion of loving companions. That requires a much greater openness to another great watchword: transformation. Now, at its best, integration without transformation will bring outer and outward cooperation, but not the dynamic peace and harmony which is at the heart of shalom, the biblical vision of loving inner and outer interdependent mutual interconnection. At its worst, integration without transformation can become assimilation, something which Indigenous people in this country have struggled with in the past, where it drives dynamic differences and unresolved conflicts underground. Instead, the great religious traditions of the world call for transformation, and that's the challenge for us today. The interfaith journey calls us to transformative spirituality rather than the old territorial or tribal spirituality. It calls us to the transformation of the inner and the outer worlds. It calls us to transformation of self, of family, of group, of nation and world, as the precondition and the process of truly divinely human integration. So the third image I share with you is that of pilgrimage, which has always been with us, but which is rediscovered, I think, in our own times. Pilgrimage as a means of compassionate inclusion and transformative integration. Because pilgrimage is common to so much of our great religious traditions. And in all of them, there is an affirmation of how pilgrimage can connect and reconnect individual psyches, group relationships, and sources of difference. And thereby it includes and it integrates, it heals and it transforms. It is true, isn't it, if you have walked on a pilgrimage or walked with others in an intentional manner, as St. Augustine of Hippo once put it, that it is solved by walking, whatever it is. The problem we have changes form, and we find strange sometimes answers as we walk alone, together. Somehow the dynamic of movement helps to set forth and set free transforming powers in our lives and world. On a pilgrimage of any great value, everyone is changed. We're never exactly the same people that we were who set off at the beginning. We've learned something, sometimes things that are quite important about ourselves and about our companions. We've been brought together by a common endeavour, bigger than our separate divisions and inclinations. So if we have not literally walked in each other's shoes, then we've certainly shared more deeply as we have walked alongside one another and in each other's footsteps. We have learned a little about what it is to see, to hear, to feel, to taste, and to smell as others do. We've grown in compassion as companions in transformation. So literally and metaphorically, pilgrimage is a powerful religious symbol and a means of transformative integration. My own experience of different pilgrimages certainly bears that out. Sometimes it has been a literal pilgrimage, even a traditional religious pilgrimage to and through various ancient sacred places. At other times, it has been a pilgrimage which has connected people and places which have had no real connection before. And this has brought down barriers as people have met one another in a different spirit, taken people literally, physically sometimes, out of the usual boxes in which we find ourselves. At other moments, it has been a pilgrimage of the heart, a pilgrimage of understanding, where if we're not literally walking together, then we are moving into new spaces together and learning to be compassionate companions. Now, if you can't move physically too far, you can do it in other ways. More recently, I've been encouraged by the inspiration of my wife, a trained labyrinth coordinator. I've learned the value of the labyrinth as a wonderful ancient tool belonging to no one particular culture or faith tradition, as a tool of walking with compassion and finding personal transformation and integration. And similarly, I think, treasuring our personal and shared dreams can bring integration of our divided selves. So again, that sounds very good, but it is hard in practice. How do we learn to be compassionate companions with one another when, for example, the demands of others for inclusion and integration can seem to threaten to overwhelm our own identities? There are several examples we could talk about, not least the perceived threat to identity for so many of the world's poorest people in the face of Western-based assumptions and the sheer power of global capitalism. How do we help very threatened people to move to genuine inclusion and integration in the face of the destruction of much of which they call sacred, and in the face of their sometimes huge pain and shattered lives? After all, we ourselves do we include everyone and everything? There are limits to inclusion and integration. In Australia, we do not these days accept racism, for instance, or gender-based violence, at least in our official public lives. So how do we help one another to grow in valuing healthy difference whilst rejecting abusive difference? How do we help one another to build the right bridges and draw the appropriate limits and lines? I have in mind here, for instance, the still potentially disruptive issue of sexuality, particularly of homosexuality, which continues to cause much angst in some religious and other quarters. This is certainly a fraught issue for religious engagement with inclusion and integration. Within the worldwide Anglican Church, of which I am a part, for example, it is a major source of conflict, especially between some in the Western world and some in other parts of the world, particularly Africa, because it raises a number of core questions about identity, about the acceptable ordering of society and individual lives, about the means by which we discern truth and holiness, and the validity of secular and culturally conditioned ideas of inclusion and integration. Now, the Australian Anglican Church itself remains divided over this issue, although personally it seems to me that in the Western world the main debate is essentially over, and actually probably a majority, as polls have shown, a majority of people in churches accept that. Indeed, in the Anglican Communion, my North American brothers and sisters several years ago received gay and lesbian people into the highest church offices. But it remains a source of vulnerability and outrage to many, and the path to inclusion is strewn with thorns, particularly in some religious quarters which have not even begun to recognise the issues. So we need more than affirmative action and legislation to move forward with inclusion and integration on this and other issues. For genuine inclusion and integration in such trying matters, we have to learn to find ways of compassionate listening and self-transformation. Being loving companions to one another does not mean agreeing with everything in the other, nor failing to allow some matters for the time being to be ones on which we agree to disagree. Which leads me therefore to my fourth and final image, that of stone walls and bridges. In England's last wilderness, where I was born, these stone walls are everywhere. They are a vital means of marking and creating space, of nurturing identity and connection. To create a stone wall is, however, a work of much great artistry. It requires great fellow feeling, or if you like, compassion, for the great variety of stones which have to be brought together in one integrated whole. It requires great loving care and patience and wisdom to build a stone wall that actually lasts and can deal with the elements. It requires, as it were, listening to the nature of each particular stone and tenderly addressing the right means for its transformation, working out which edges need to be softened or which bit of the stone needs to be removed. This demands considerable time and application and the right heart. If not, if you rush into it, stones do not easily come together or integrate. They might form a harmony from force, but it's not a true harmony. You only have true harmony from caring connection. When undue force is applied, they will break, shatter, or collapse upon one another. But with the right sensitivity, with a compassionate mind and heart, rough edges can be removed, angular surfaces can blend and support one another, and the hardest stones can be transformed. And that, I would say, is very much an image of the religious task of nurturing compassionate inclusion and transformative integration. So may we learn the skills of the master builder and the artist. My final Stonewall picture is from a famous work by the wonderful northern nature sculptor Andy Goldsworthy. In his creation, as you see, the stone wall forms not a barrier, but a bridge or a path. It follows the contours of the heart, taking each of the different shapes of the stones and melding their qualities together, but not destroying their identity. Thereby weaves in and out of the life's obstacles and helps us to negotiate and travel onward together through all climates of change. So be it. Thank you.
Our next speaker for Plenary 6 is Dr. Krzysztof Batorowicz, Director of Multicultural Centre of the University of Southern Queensland. After completing his degree in law, Dr. Krzysztof Batorowicz occupied various legal positions in Poland within the justice system. When he visited Australia in 1984, he undertook research work with special reference to equal opportunity, human rights, and sociology. Since that time, he has been living permanently in Australia and has worked in the higher education sector in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Toowoomba. Recently, he has extended his interest in the area of multiculturalism. In addition to presentations at conferences in Australia, he has been invited to present papers in a number of European and Asian countries. His articles have been published widely in Australia and overseas. Currently, Dr. Batorowicz is the Foundation Director of the Multicultural Centre at the University of Southern Queensland. Please welcome Dr. Krzysztof Batorowicz.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like firstly to thank the organizers for invitation to the forum. The organizers are very kind, very inclusive, and as we all know very well, significant contributors to inclusion and integration in this local community and beyond. However, I must admit I have a problem whether the right speaker was selected in this case. I'm not expert on these issues. I have neither background in peace studies nor qualification in theology. I'm not a peace activist, politician, or army general who is able to go or stop the war. However, I will try to tackle the topic inclusion and integration, a journey to peace and harmony, simply starting with the question, what are inclusion and integration? I tried my best to find out simple definitions. I was not very successful. I had high expectations, but I can offer from a number of different sources. For example, inclusion, the action or state of including or being included within a group or structure, and integration. There are a number of meanings. Perhaps the most useful for this forum would be meaning as an act or instance of integrating racial, religious, or ethnic groups, or an act or instance of integrating of organization, place of business, school, and so on. The majority of other definitions are from very specific professional perspectives, not relevant for a so global interdisciplinary topic. So I look at a broader question and an example. I found it a very broad question relevant to the theme of the forum. Can world peace really happen? can world peace really happen? This is a question from Judith Snow, a person with severe disability from Canada. As me, she was asked to say a few words during a public meeting. I think the selected part of her story are worth noting for further personal reflection and perhaps for later discussion. It is about specific understanding of peace, but also the elements of our interest, inclusion and introduction and interaction, or exclusion and a lack of interaction. I'm quoting. I was born in 1949 in Oshawa, Ontario, to a very ordinary lower middle class family. By the time I was 7 months old, I had never tried to sit. And it was apparent that I was not developing in a usual way. After months of trip into Toronto to see many doctors, my parents were told I had muscular dystrophy and that I would not likely to live past age 4. Certainly they miscalculated. What is true is that I have a very rare sort of body. I have the same muscle strength now that I had whereas when I was born. I have a baby strength spread over an adult body, which means I can move everything a very teeny little bit and nothing except my face very much. I do a lot with my face. In our world, we call the situation a disability. One day, when I was 6 years old, my father was washing and dressing me. As I sat there, he explained to me that some doctors in the United States were putting children with Down syndrome to death because they believe that society should not have to bear the burden of the extra cost that caring for these children would bring. Dad grew up in rural England in a small community in the southwest of the island. The major economic activities, they were raising cows and sheep and digging rocks to plant potatoes. He explained that as children with slower thinking grew up, they were able to grow potatoes along with everyone else. Such folks live and work alongside of each other with no distinction made. But in his boyhood, he said, children like me were killed because no one had enough food or the other resources to support someone who would like not to be able to grow food. I asked him why he and they were still keeping me alive. He replied that perhaps I would be the one to find out the answer. Being a very straightforward kid, I never asked him what was the question I was seeking an answer for. I simply believe that the question he meant me to answer was, why do people get muscular dystrophy? I decided I would be a research doctor and started to take a deeper interest in school. In my teens, I held the burden of isolation and rejection. The question I had to answer turned into, why is society so mean to people with disabilities? By the time I was 16, the medical prediction obviously had shifted, and they said I would live until I was 30. My parents were clear that I should have the same kind of opportunities as my 3 siblings, and my mother spent 2 years finding a university that was sufficiently flat so that I could get into the essential courses. There was no mandate for accessibility in those days. I continued to enjoy my academics, and in 1968 I entered an honors Bachelor of Arts program in mathematics and psychology at York University. Still, I had no real future, and 1978 found me living in chronic care hospital, gradually losing my little remaining muscular strength and struggling to breathe without coughing. My tongue was near. However, at the same time, the determined side of me was going back to York University 4 days a week to run Canada First Center for Learning Support. As I had completed my BA and next MA at York, I had realized that there are many students of potential students and even some staff and faculty members of the university who would be empowered if there was somebody around to help them organize the accommodations they need to do the work more effectively. The blind students who needed a brain map to get oriented, and some volunteers to read text on tapes. The professor with newly acquired multiple sclerosis who needed to get registered for Wheel-Trans and so on. In 1976, with a seed grant from Atkinson Charitable Foundation, I set up this campus support system. Now, every university and college in Canada has one. While on campus, I met Professor of Graduate Studies in Education, Marsha Forrest. She was researching the value of inclusive education, classrooms where students of diverse academic abilities study together. She and I became great friends and challenged each other to how far this idea could go. I began to see myself through her eyes as a vital, intense woman with good ideas, interesting questions, and much more to give, and to take the part-time job a bed in a chronic care hospital and mental death sentence could give me room for. Through Marsha and her husband Jack, president of Frontier College, I met many more energetic and paradigm-breaking people. I began to hope I could live. The short version of the long struggle is the late 79. I found out my increasing ill health was due to an allergy, and my sense of futility was due to being trapped in service system dedicated to conform dying people. I lived on other couches for a while, and by June 1980, with the intense political and personal support of all sorts of people, I became Canada's first person to have government-funded individualized support, money to pay the wages of assistants who will go with me throughout the day so I can work and live as fully participating citizen. I wanted to know how it was that Marsha and many of the people I met throughout her and Jack were able to see me as not as a defective person with a dysfunctional body that could not meet the demand of life, but as an interesting and resourceful colleague who lives in some unusual challenges and opportunities. Some evidence, different approach, and extremely different personal and social outcomes. I realize that people who label disabled are always contributing something. I also gain evidence that we would contribute much more to the economy and our communities if we actually supported to make the contribution we are good at making, not the contribution others think we should have been able to make. I will stop her story here. She became a very successful advocate for people with disabilities, and her contribution to the community, or we can say to peace, following her question, was significant indeed. This was an example of exclusion-inclusion from individual perspectives. Now we can look how we can apply the concept of inclusion at broader community level. In the literature from Scotland, I found some very practical tips for community building based on inclusion. Firstly, make sure that one section of the community does not dominate the process of capacity building. Although you want your activity to be driven by community need, it is important to recognize that what is effective for one section of the community is not always best for others. Secondly, some so-called disadvantaged communities need more support to ensure their voice is heard and they are able to have power in the decision-making process. Thirdly, remember that everyone is individual. People do not always like to be categorized as particular disadvantaged group, and individuals with equality groups will have vastly different experiences, views, and opinions. Think about the barriers that people might face because of things like age, gender, disability, faith, ethnic origin, communication, language, income, or family responsibilities. Now we can ask the question, why social inclusion? Social exclusion is a phenomenon that faces and affects all societies. The breaking of social and familiar ties which results in persons living in the margins of society. This is particularly the case with displaced persons, and in particular migrants far from home and without normal support system. Social inclusion, on the other hand, is about strengthening connections between groups of people and enabling individuals to fully participate, contribute, and benefit from a society. The process of integrating migrants into a host country is often described as a two-way process of mutual commitment from newcomers and the citizens of the host nation to respect and accept each other. Indeed, theological literature, especially writing John Paul II, who wrote every year on peace to support the International Day of Peace, there are concepts of building peace and culture of peace. The last, culture of peace, is our particular interest, as unlike others, he sees an important role of religion here. He notes, I'm quoting, "In the end, peace is not essentially about structure, but about people. Certain structures and mechanisms of peace, judicial, political, economic, are of course necessary and do exist. But they have been driven from nothing other than the accumulated wisdom and experience of gestures of peace made by men and women throughout history who have kept hope and not given in to the discouragement. Gestures of peace spring from the lives of people who foster peace first of all in their own hearts. Religion has a vital role in fostering gestures of peace and in consolidating conditions for peace. It exercises the role and more effective if concentrates in what is proper to it, attention to God, the fostering of universal brotherhood, and the spreading of culture of human solidarity. The Day of Prayer for Peace, which I promoted in Assisi in 2002, involving people of many religions, had this purpose. It expresses a desire to nurture peace by spreading a spirituality and culture of peace." End of quote. Let me share with you some my own work associated with inclusion or lack of it. Perhaps, as some of you, I expected that the year 2000 will be specially a year of peace and celebrations, free of major international conflicts. Unfortunately, it was not the case. I undertook detailed analysis of major conflicts reported in 2000. The time limit that does not permit me to do this here, but I would like to make at least some generalization. Analyzing the major conflicts of international significance which happened in 2000, the specific affected countries involve an impact on other countries and the international community, we need to find out the major reason or reasons of these conflicts. My analysis demonstrated that the main reasons for the conflicts were problems related to race, ethnicity, or religion. We can generalize that the reasons for these social conflicts were the inability to deal with cultural differences and to employ inclusion, even within the same country. The practical example was 2000's events in Indonesia, Fiji, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Solomon Islands, Kosovo, Germany, China, South Africa support this thesis. We need to know that the conflicts have nothing to do with democracy or lack of democracy in particular countries affected by these conflicts. Countries considered as the best example of democracy, such as USA or Switzerland, were also reported in 2000. They also experienced a problem in dealing with cultural diversity and were not inclusive to own citizens or inhabitants. Similarly, there is no relation between the level of economic development and the ability to deal with ethnic differences. The appropriate examples that are both groups of countries were reported in 2000 as having conflicts. For instance, on one hand the Solomon Islands, or Fiji, on the other Germany or the USA. Conflicts in 2000 were between countries' nations, Russia, Chechnya, Israel, the Palestinians, or within country, Fiji, South Africa, Nigeria. The conflicts of 2000 produced war between countries, Middle East, Kosovo, Russia, with victims, dead or wounded people, Indonesia, Middle East, Zimbabwe, Kosovo, mass movement of people, Indonesia, Solomon Islands, Middle East, or serious abuse of human rights, China, Germany. The results of this analysis and the surprising inclusion of countries like Switzerland or USA requires stating the notion that no country or nation, regardless of level of development, traditional democracy, economic achievements of development of democratic institutions, is free from conflicts with potential danger to the region or world peace. I made the theory of cultural differences as the main source of contemporary reasons of wars, civil wars, social conflicts, and other undesirable social events. Firstly, the major social conflicts of 2000 between nations and within particular countries were based on inability to deal with cultural differences. Secondly, the social conflicts can be avoided if the racial, ethnic, or religious differences are dealt with in a different way than they have been to date. In order to put the theory into practice, we need to consider the most important directions from people like John Paul II or Venerable Master Ching Kung, and the practice of some countries. In relation to the latest, the practice, I'm suggesting a serious consideration be given to Australian multicultural policy, a unique policy that produced, at least so far, quite good results. The ability to live in social harmony and to appreciate the benefits of cultural diversity for this country and its people. We are the lucky country indeed. However, to summarize this part, let me make a final formulation of the theory. The major contemporary conflicts within states or between them leading to war, ethnic cleansings, civil wars, racial and ethnic riots, protests, forced immigration, religious persecutions, and conflicts are results of the government's inabilities and unwillingness to deal with cultural diversity and inclusion. The implications of the theory. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that the issue of cultural difference exists in contemporary societies, even if they have the tradition of monocultural, monolingual, homogeneous, with one religion, official or not. The issue of cultural difference, although at different degree in particular countries, can be found by observation, research, statistic, or social analysis. Secondly, the theory encourages all to recognize the significance of the issue of cultural differences and exclusion. The recognition of this phenomenon is the sine qua non condition to positive development, as there are strong tendencies to ignore the significance of race, ethnicity, or religion. Thirdly, the attitude towards cultural differences should be positive. The fact that society possesses the differences more or less visible, this is a positive aspect which should be utilized for the benefit of the whole society. The implementation of the main thesis that all contemporary conflicts are based on lack of acceptance of cultural differences, to be successful requires a positive attitude of government and relevant international organizations, so simultaneously in practice a change of attitudes and the belief that such a change can improve social development towards more harmonious societies. The important point is that the governments of the other relevant countries should see the existing cultural diversity in the countries as a positive feature of the societies. This is not necessarily attractive or easy approach in some countries, especially those with nationalistic tradition. But to overcome the barrier from negative towards a positive, viewing cultural diversity is necessary, although not a very easy step. I don't intend to give simple panacea on how to do it. However, a number of comparisons can be made. One of them is with the natural resources. We can ask the question, what is better to have in a country one or two natural resources, let's say coal only, or coal, silver, oil, or all previously listed and others in appropriate quantity? And the answer is obvious. Similarly, we can ask about the diverse of landscape of a country, and whether a country with or without it, the diversity will be more attractive in general terms for tourists, visitors, and so on. The next aspect is the realization of the benefits arising from cultural diversity within a country. Again, this should be done in positive spirits. Particular significance, however, should be focused on educational programs aiming to show the real benefits of cultural diversity, inclusion, and introduction. The varieties of benefits include cultural, educational, business internationalization, development of other contacts, trade, tourism, and so on. It is important that educational programs are delivered at national, local, and international level. It should be part of the national school curriculum at all levels. Educational programs should present the positive face of cultural diversity and associate it with the potential for development of society, as opposed to ugly face of racism and intolerance and the worst consequences throughout human history. To summarize the topic, inclusion and integration, a journey to peace and harmony, I would like to say that inclusion and integration are very important instruments contributing to peace and harmony. We all should contribute to peace and harmony through inclusion and integration. We should do it in our families, workplaces, and local communities. Without this, it's very hard to achieve inclusion and integration on local, national, international, or global levels. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the forum. Peace be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Batorowicz. The next speaker is Mr. Lim K. Tham. Mr. Lim K. Tham comes from Singapore, and he is the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, Singapore. He is also a member of the Presidential Council on Religious Harmony, and also a member of the Working Committee on Racial and Religious Harmony. A man very much into community service, serves in a number of boards and committees. Among them are the Advisor to Yong Eun Care Centre, General Secretary in the Boys Brigade Asia, and Board Member on the Bible Society of Singapore. Mr. Lim K. Tham has flown all the way from Singapore to attend this forum. We are very thankful for your time. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lim K. Tham to the stage.
I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the organizers for the invitation to come and take part in this special forum. I'd like to thank the various speakers who have given so much input to the forum. And a very special word of thanks to the many volunteers who have waited upon us and have been so friendly and so dedicated in their service. Thank you very much. It is a very special privilege for me to be here. I have enjoyed the time and I have learned a lot from all the discussions and the sessions. Thank you very much for having me. And now a word about my sharing. I have been asked to share the Singapore experience with all of you. I'm humbled by the interest shown in what is happening in our little country, and I hope in what follows to say a little bit more. It has often been said that peace and harmony is a journey. And I would like to borrow the words from Lyndon B. Johnson, that this journey runs 1,000 miles, and it must be taken one step at a time. What is being underscored by the former US President is that it is not easy to achieve peace and harmony, and that deliberate and sustained efforts are needed for the task. In what follows, I would like to share the steps taken by the government of Singapore to maintain social harmony among its people. Of course, not being in government, I can only speak of what I personally am aware of. In other words, I will not be exhaustive. Thankfully, there are quite a number of Singaporeans or former Singaporeans in our midst, including Mr. Muhammad Hanif. And I'm sure all of them will be able to fill in the many gaps in my presentation. But first, a brief sketch of the ethno-religious landscape in Singapore. Singapore is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious society. This has been so since the early days of the island's history, when it was a trading hub by virtue of its location at which some of the world's major civilizations and religions intersected, namely in the Straits of Malacca at the tip of the Malayan Peninsula. Now, its diversity is not unique, but the fact that so many different races and cultures and religions are contained within so small a country is. Now, at 710 square kilometers in size, we are probably the most densely populated country in the world. And that is our unique claim, not the fact that we are diverse. Ethnically, Singapore's population of some 5.3 million people within so small a space is made up of many races, namely the Chinese, comprising 74.2%, Malay, Indian, with the rest being Eurasians, the Peranakans, Europeans, and people of different origins. So other than the Malay race, members of all the other ethnic groups are either descended from immigrants who came to our island in search of a better life, or are themselves immigrants. Now, not surprisingly, the diversity of race has led to a diversity of religion. So today, almost every major world religion is practiced in our country, while other major religions or new religious movements have made inroads. And this is a feature. Most of all, or all the religions that are here in our country have global links and are subject to foreign influences, given the fact that each religion is of external provenance. It has come from overseas. So in recent years and following global trends, religions have had a resurgence of sorts in the island. The push forward towards modernization, the persistent pursuit of economic growth, and the resultant strains on daily life have acted to make religious faith more alluring, more attractive, and had deepened the religiosities among the believers across the board. So to quote a research fellow who has observed and studied the religious scene in our country, religious affiliation is high and religious identification is strong among the population. To some extent, religious affiliation in Singapore is culturally and racially structured. The statistics bear out the link between race and religion. So almost 2/3 of the Chinese are Buddhists or Taoists. And nearly 100% of our Malays are Muslim, while slightly more than half of the Indians are Hindus. So conversely, Buddhism or Taoism is viewed as a Chinese religion, Islam as a Malay religion, and Hinduism as an Indian religion, all with the exception of Christianity, which draws its adherents from all races, and no particular group has the predominance. Now, how diverse the landscape is can be seen from the latest data on religion. And here you can see the population shares ascribed to the various main religions in Singapore. Notice that Buddhism, if you include Taoism, has the majority. Let me go on, having given you the landscape of Singapore, to the fault lines or the challenges that exist within such a diverse and small nation. Despite the diversity, the state of affairs in interracial and interreligious relations in Singapore has been rated as positive, as healthy. People coexist harmoniously with one another, and the occasional misunderstanding or hiccup is quickly diffused. However, this happy state of being was not always so. In the nation's pre-independence past, that is during the time before 1965, there had been bloody riots due to racial and religious conflicts. So these days, Singaporeans are often reminded by the government not to take things for granted, because social harmony is fragile. Since September 11, many national leaders have expressed concern that those events of 9/11 had both widened the country's racial and religious fault lines and had narrowed the common space within the country. This remark is a realistic acknowledgement that social harmony in Singapore in particular is not immune, is not inaccessible to the excesses of global religious fundamentalism. I, for one, am glad that we are facing up to the challenges that are inherent in a multiracial, multicultural, and multi-religious society. Pluralism may be celebrated, but there is a phase of pluralism that reinforces and heightens identities and differences, which, if they are exploited or mishandled, can then result in misunderstanding, intolerance, and even hostility. So the key task in a harmonious society like Singapore is to go beyond managing the tensions simmering below the surface calm to fostering a cohesive and inclusive society. So how does the state in Singapore perceive its role in managing its diversity and thus secure peace and harmony? I'd like to quote the words from a government official which define its approach. And this is what he had said. We must not assume that religious harmony we enjoy is a natural state of affairs. Again, a reminder of how delicate the matter can be. In many parts of the world, religious strife tears countries apart. And such conflicts can easily occur in Singapore too, if we are not careful. And so to keep the peace, we must keep working at it, both top-down and bottom-up. I underline the word, we must keep working. There's no let-up. And the approach must be from the top down and the bottom up. These are the various top-down ideas. And I will talk about each of these very, very briefly. Social secularization. So working from top down, the government has chosen the path of secularization. And sometimes the term secularism is used, but there is a difference, as you know. And the rule of law. So while guaranteeing religious freedom, the government has insisted that religious groups stay out of politics. And in one fell swoop, potential inter-religious contentions arising from politically related controversies are averted. And in the formulation of national policies, religious influence is kept at bay, even if religious leaders are sometimes consulted. There can be little doubt that by maintaining religious neutrality, the government of Singapore has laid the ground for peaceful coexistence of the different religious communities. Meritocracy. Under the state's policy of meritocracy, individuals are treated equally and given equal opportunity to progress and to excel. No person is disadvantaged on account of race, language, or religion. The removal of these factors from reckoning for university places, employment opportunities and promotions, etc., has fostered not only a fair and just society, but a harmonious one as well. The third idea may come across as unfriendly for some cases, is legislation. Legal instruments have been enacted to ensure tolerance and respect for race and religions. Some of these instruments range from the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, the Sedition Act, the Penal Code, the Societies Act, and to the famous Internal Security Act, under which people acting against public order and security could be detained without trial for a renewable period of 2 years. And as a recent study has concluded, given the extensive power of the state, the religious impulse had been bounded, had been properly controlled. And under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, a special committee known as the Presidential Council for Religious Harmony, of which I'm a member of, has been formed to help to advise the government on how to resolve any religious conflicts. And I'm happy to say that in the 25 to 30 years existence of this committee, we have not performed any duty. There was no need for us to come together to advise the government on what to do, because there has not been any serious conflict requiring this committee's intervention. Next, the electoral system, being a democratic society. So intentional is the state in fostering social harmony, it has even tweaked its electoral system to ensure minority representation in Parliament. So under a scheme known as the Grouped Representation Constituency, certain districts or constituencies are grouped into larger clusters with 3 to 6 sitting members of Parliament each. And so political parties wishing to contest seats within such clusters are required to field at least one candidate from the minority communities or races. Has the scheme worked to achieve its desired goals? The answer is in the affirmative, because the system has ensured sufficient minority representation in Parliament and has forced political parties to practice multiracial politics. Finally, last but not least, recognizing that the various top-down strategies have their limitations, the government has stepped up engagement with the different religious communities to seek the common good. And religious leaders are being consulted for views concerning public policies, though, as I have said, secular and pragmatic considerations will always prevail over religious ones. And at the national level, a special National Steering Committee on Racial and Religious Harmony has been set up to bring apex, that means the supreme religious and ethnic leaders, together on a regular basis to confer, to interact, and to strategize among themselves on how relations across the racial and religious community can be maintained and further strengthened. And as great importance is attached to the work of this committee, at least 4 government ministers are in full membership. And in fact, the committee is chaired by the minister himself. And I'm not aware of any other platform in which a Christian bishop, a mufti of the Islamic faith, a Buddhist abbot, or a Hindu chief priest, or a Taoist master can sit opposite government ministers, mayors, and senior servants to talk about religion and all other issues that impinge upon our daily life. And of course, the value of this steering committee is that by bringing the religious leaders together on a regular basis, it has already achieved a purpose in building friendship and goodwill among those who come. What about the bottom-up approaches? To cascade down the message of tolerance to the grassroots, the government has established networks of people known as Interracial and Religious Confidence Circle, IRCC, in every constituency. These circles supported by resources and manpower by the government, bring people of different races and religions together for interaction, for dialogue, and for relationship building. Organized activities by this IRCC include visits to places of worship, and that would mean hosting as well people from different faiths to your own places of worship, celebrations of religious festivals, and even sports and games. Currently, about 90% of all grassroots organizations, religious ones as well, are now part of these networks. Last but not least, mention must be made of a government-led effort to craft a declaration of religious harmony. The code represents the inputs of leaders and members drawn from nearly all the faith communities. And each year, the declaration is circulated among all, and in particular, the school-going children, in hopes that the message of religious moderation, tolerance, and respect will not only break anew, but will inspire more steps to be taken. And already at schools, our children daily recite a pledge to be one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion. Let me conclude. Religious diversity continues to present numerous challenges to any nation, but in particular, small ones like ours. It is not a natural state for people in such society to live in peace and harmony. It is not. That we, in our little tiny island, are able to enjoy a high level of harmony is the result of vast amount of care devoted to attaining and strengthening that. Now, we are of course still a long way from engendering something genuine and lasting, but the first steps have been taken, and more must be done to sustain and build upon them. I am confident that we will make further progress in the long journey, because our religious leaders are now united, and many of them have become even friends. Thank you very much.